Hello and welcome to this short screencast on data handling in the Meteor application template. The idea here is we want to kind of figure out how do we get data in the system and the various users and so forth. So to answer that question, I think the first thing that's important to do is to understand how the system kind of starts up in Meteor. How does it all work? And basically what happens is when the system starts up, inside the top level server directory, it's going to run this main.js on the server side, and on the client side it's going to run inside the client folder the main.js inside there. Okay, with respect to kind of the initialization stuff, what is more interesting is what happens on the server side, because that's where we're going to get stuff in. And what we can see when the server starts up, it's going to execute this file, which means it's going to first start by importing the stuff in the import startup both directory. So if we go to imports startup both, we see this index.js, and that says that what we want to do, by the way, both means that this is stuff that should be executed on both the client and server sides at startup. And what this means is that at startup, on either the client or server side, we're basically going to import the stuff directory. So imports API stuff, index.js, we're just going to import stuff.js. Okay, so after all that, this is the code that initially gets, the very first code that gets run on the server side. And for this template application, we have this collection called stuff. We create a new Mongo collection. Then we use simple schema to define a new schema, and we make it reactive using this tracker thing. And the schema has 4 fields: name, quantity, username, condition. We have the condition is like an enumerated type, which you'll see later will kind of automatically be translated into a select or used to create a select form control. And then after we define this schema, we're going to attach the schema to our collection, and then we're going to export both. We need some places we need the stuff collection to kind of manipulate the documents in the collection, and we also need this stuff schema, because the stuff schema, this thing, is what we're going to pass to our autoform call, so that autoform can kind of generate a form which will make sure that these constraints are satisfied. Okay. But all that to be said, we now have this schema for the Mongo collection that's going to make sure that all the documents have a name, quantity, username, and condition field. So that's what happens on the server side when we import the both. The next thing we do is we want to execute this line, import startup server. So if we go to import startup server, we look at the index.js. That says we want to import 2 things, accounts.js and stuff.js. So first let's look at accounts.js. And here you can see that we are going to define some users. Okay, and so what we do is, if you get to this line of code here, we see, are there any users? If there are some users already, then we don't do anything. But if there aren't any users, then we're going to look at meteor.settings.default accounts, which is going to be this file, or actually I should say this field within this file, settings.development.json. Why is that? The reason is because when we run the system using meteor npm start, which is what you can see here is what we did, meteor npm run start, that is going to execute this script start, which says meteor no release check -- settings /config settings development.json. So we're passing this in as our settings file because we ran that specific command. And so we have this defaults accounts field, which is referenced right here. So we see that this field actually exists. So then we do a console.log saying create the default users. So we're going to map through that array, okay, with 2 objects in it, and we're going to pass it this function, which is going to destructure the passed object into 3 variables: email, password, or 3 parameters: email, password, and role. We call create users with email, password, and role, which is this function right here. It says create user, and then we call the meteor create user function with an email. We're going to make sure that the username is the same as the email address. We do it this way, and whatever the default password was. And then, if it's the case that there is a field called role with the value admin that in this account, then what we're going to do is we're going to add that user that we've just defined. We're going to use the aligning roles package to define a role for that user called admin. So aligning roles is the standard kind of way to create different roles for users, and it's got a lot of functionality, and I'm using it in its very most simplest way here, but it's not, still quite effective for creating an admin user. And note that there's no need to only have one admin user. There's no need to define, the admin user as being admin at foo.com. I could have 5 admin users, all with different emails and passwords and so forth. And so, but for this particular purpose, I'm just having one of them. So now in our system, we have, by default, we will have one user called admin at foo.com, who is an admin user, who has the admin role, and another just regular old user called John. Okay, so that is the result of this first line, import accounts.js. The second line is import .stuff.js, and so let's look at this file right here. So we've defined some default users. Again, all starting with this initially loading of this server main.js. We've been indirecting through all these import statements and gradually getting down to loading these files. So this file is the second thing that's going to, and final thing I think, that's going to be loaded when we load that main.js. And what this one does is to define some default data. So if I go here, what you can see is, we had that create default users. Now we have this thing line creating default data. And it's really very much the same kind of thing as before. We check to see if there's a meteor.settings.default data field. So if we go here, we can see here's the default data field. It's an array of objects just like before. And so then we map through it, and we get a data object, and we call add data. So we call this function here, and we just insert that document. Okay, and obviously if you mess up, you're going to get some errors in the console when it tries to do this insert, saying that the schema was violated, for example, if you don't have all the required fields. But in this case we do, so everything works fine. The other thing that happens on the server side when we define this, load this stuff.js file, is we're going to define 2 publications. So hopefully you've been reading about Meteor and the pub-sub model. Basically on the server side, you define publications, which are specifications for how data will be streamed and kind of cached on the server, or how collections, I should say, or portions of collections or portions of documents, it's very, very flexible, can be published to the clients and cached there in their own local little mini Mongo database. This first publication is called Stuff, and basically what it says is that if the user's logged in, then we will find the user's username and we will publish to that client all of the documents in the Stuff collection which has the username equal to the logged in user. Basically, we're publishing to a user their stuff and only their stuff. Okay? So that's that publication called Stuff, but we have a second one called Stuff Admin. And the way this publication works is it says, okay, well, if we have a logged in user, so this.user ID is defined, and that particular user is in the admin role, then what's going to happen is we're going to publish everything in the Stuff collection. So that's the, kind of the, for this particular system where I'm trying to show that admins can have superpowers, and the superpower associated with this particular publication is that someone who has been defined with this role, okay, is able to see everything. And note that, the way the system is constructed, the only way you can get that role is having been in the settings.development.json file with role admin. There's no other way to get it. You can't get this defined for you on the client side. And so, as long as you can find out what this account is and what the password is by looking at this file, which in general should be a kind of a protected file. And there's other ways you can do this so that you don't even have to publish the password in clear text, but we're making things simple for the moment. So for prototyping purposes, this is good. For other purposes, you would not want to do this, and there are generally accepted ways in Meteor to not publish passwords and have them have the user get them via setting a form and having email verification and so forth. Okay, so anyway, so we've got these two publications, one for general users and one for admin users. And that, I think, is all I want to say. Let me just look. Yeah, so that's the basic idea of data in this particular application. We have one collection called stuff. It's defined here. And we have it initialized here. And we have it initialized here. And then we have it published here. Once we get in the user interface, I'll start to show you how we subscribe to it, but I will leave that to a future video. Yeah.